David, and everyone here for this wonderful conference. I already have so many more questions than I did before, and I think that is perhaps one of the things that makes a conference great. I'm going to be presenting a case study today, and I'm a little bit nervous because I'm talking about a masterpiece that a lot of people have talked about. So here's my effort to say something new. But as Gâlib says, that the effort for originality, that is never, the sea of originality can never be dried up. So here it goes. Oh, and my screen. 1 second. Okay. I'm going to leave a structural map on the screen for you while I talk, because it takes a little while, I think, to take in, and I will come back to it. I mean, I will be talking about it throughout. So anyway, eminent Ottoman poet of the 18th century, Şeyh Gâlib was the quintessential multilingual Ottoman Sufi. He was the head of the Mevlevi Lodge of Galata in Istanbul and the author of works in both Turkish and Arabic. Gâlib came from a family of 3 generations of influential Mevlevi dervishes. He was the close friend and sheikh of Selim III, and during his time, his lodge became a booming center for the arts. Gâlib's magnum opus is an allegorical work of narrative poetry in Turkish, the Mesnevian romance named Hüsn, Aşk, Beauty and Love. Hüsn, Aşk narrates a love story of 2 characters named Hüsn, Beauty, and Aşk, Love. The mystical journey of Aşk to unite with his beloved Hüsn is filled with characters with various conceptual names, the most prominent of whom is Aşk's spiritual master, Sühan, word, a major avenue for Gâlib's expression of his understanding of spiritual and poetic language. Starting with the Republican period in Turkey, several scholars have offered various interpretations of Hüsn Aşk, the most famous of these being Abdülbaki Gölpınarlı and Victoria Holbrook. In her Unreadable Shores of Love, the latter offered an in-depth analysis of Gâlib's understandings of poetry, love, and the universe that also took into account the text's modern reception. My talk today is an attempt to offer a more closely knit structure to Holbrook's scattered avenues of interpretation, while agreeing and disagreeing with some of the interpretive choices made by her and other commentators. Of course, there's a lot that I wanted to say here, and 20 minutes proved to be very, very short. So, and also to add that this is a work in progress, and I'm very open to suggestions. I aim to interpret Şeyh Gâlib's Hüsn Aşk along 2 major axes. The first is the influence of the thought of Ibn Arabi and the doctrine of the oneness of being. The second is the role of Celaleddin Rumi in the production of the work, whom Gâlib refers to as the Anatolian prophet. Gâlib's conceptualization of language and literature exemplifies a creative synthesis of these 2 spheres of influence. Rumi is identified with Sühan in the text as Gâlib's own spiritual master, while the Mesnevi, the model for Gâlib's artistic creation, is described as the essence of the Quran. Sühan is also the barzah, the limit between the purely physical and purely intelligible realms, between the beloved and the lover. First, a short summary of the work is in order for those who haven't read it. The work begins with sections in praise of God, the Prophet, with a section on his ascension, Rumi, and Gâlib's own father, Rashid Effendi, who was his first Sufi master. In accord with the Mesnevi romance genre, beauty and love are together in their early childhood, where they're part of a tribe named Beni Muhabbet, Sons of Love, and attend a school named Mektebi Edeb, the School of Proper Conduct, or the School of Learning. I'm using a modern Turkish transliteration just to make things easier. And they're then together in a place named the Nusretgâh-ı Mâna, the Garden of Meaning, where their guide is a person named Sühan, word. Hüsn falls in love with Aşk, but Aşk fails to reciprocate. The 2 lovers are then separated by a figure named Hayret, bewilderment, who is the leader of the tribe. I will have to skip some details due to time constraints. This separation ignites the hidden love in Aşk, but his request to marry Hüsn is refused by the elders of the tribe, who tell Aşk to go on a journey to the land of the heart and obtain the alchemy there. Aşk goes on in this journey with his companion and teacher guided spiritual efforts. During their journey, they encounter several obstacles and are aided by Sühan to overcome them. First, they're trapped by a giant in a well. Then they freeze in an endless steppe. Then they're hung on a cross across from a fire by a witch. Sühan tells Aşk that Hüsn is the Shah of the land of beauty, and she's the one who has sent him to help Aşk on his journey. They meet Hüşrüba, the robber of the mind, who is the Chinese emperor's daughter and looks like Hüsn, but lacks the ability to speak. Hüşrüba entraps Aşk in the castle of the essence of form, Zat-ı Süver. When Aşk has weakened to the point of dying, Sühan appears in the form of an old doctor and takes him to the castle of the heart, where the palace of the Shah is found. But Sühan is told that this palace is nothing but the garden of meaning mentioned earlier, that Hüsn and Aşk are one and the same. At this point, Sühan tells Aşk that his closeness with Sühan is now over. It is Hayret who will be taking Aşk to the Shah. The story ends as Aşk is accompanied by Hayret to the presence of Hüsn. As you can see, I hope that wasn't too distracting for you while I spoke. As you can see, in my interpretation of the work, I posit 3 levels of allegory, each serving as a mirror image of the others. These depict the manifestation of the universe, the Sufi's mystical journey towards God, and the act of writing as expressed by Gâlib's composition of Hüsn Aşk. In the first level of the allegory, that of the mystical journey, Aşk is the wayfarer and Hüsn is God. This allegory partakes in the narrative structures of Attar's famous Conference of the Birds, a fact openly expressed by Gâlib. When Sühan is compared to the hoopoe in the beginning of the journey, at the end of the work, when Aşk finally arrives at the castle of the heart, this place is likened to Mount Kaf, and its doors resemble the sea mook. Aşk's entire spiritual journey ends with his realization that he had always been one with God. By the way, also in the beginning of the work, Gâlib speaks reverently of Attar. The Beni Muhabbet in this allegory is the dervish order or the Sufi community in general. Gâlib describes this tribe as all those who have experienced spiritual suffering. So, 1 second, I have to move so I can see the English version. Those poets who give life to the word say that Mejnun was from that tribe. Of course, there's a whole area of reference to Fuzuli's Leyla ve Mejnun, which I'm not going to get into, and Mesnevi romances. Whoever is entangled in trouble is, of course, a member of this tribe. According to this level of the allegory, the initial unity between God and the lover can be identified with one's spiritual state in childhood, where the wayfarer has not yet reached the spiritual maturity to become aware of his separation from God. In the tale, the Mektebi Edeb, in which the lovers are together, is described as a place in which togetherness and separation have not yet been differentiated. Aşk's failure to reciprocate Hüsn love can be interpreted as the wayfarer's inability to let go of his ego. Gâlib's descriptions of this failure underline Aşk's preoccupation with his own selfhood. The path begins when Hayret, bewilderment, separates the two lovers, when the wayfarer recognizes himself as God's beloved and the spiritual awareness of separation emerges. After the wayfarer passes several spiritual obstacles, which Holbrook identifies with various human faculties, he arrives at the castle of Hüşrüba, a personification of the world of the seen, Alem Shahadet. In this level of the allegory, the wayfarer's entrapment in the castle can be interpreted as a spiritual level in which the wayfarer experiences God's beauty in her creation and feels a contentment that hinders his achievement of oneness with God, possible only when all else is abandoned. The reason for Holbrook's rejection of this level of the allegory, underlined by previous commentators, despite it being the most obvious, was her focus on another level of allegory, that of an ontological explication of the universe, number 3 in our chart. As underlined by Holbrook, Gâlib's ontology is based on an Akbari understanding of theophany and presences. Several verses openly express the sphere of influence. In a passage entitled Dar Vücudu Sühan, on the existence of the word, Gâlib undertakes an explication of wujud. One moment. If we accept their existence in the outside world, locus of theophany and the name are like twins. Prior to revival and death, God, the most beneficent, was already the reviver. Yet the created and the act of creation were joined in the name of the Creator. The names change form at each moment. The movements of the skies thus change with them. Do not think that opposites come from the essence. All the traces come forth from the attributes. This short passage makes reference to the Ibn Arabi's or Akbari doctrines of theophany, God's names and attributes, perpetual recreation, and the coincidence of opposites. According to this level of the allegory, Hüsn is God's essence, her oneness prior to creation. Creation begins with the truth of Muhammad. Let me go back. Yes, creation begins with the truth of Muhammad. This is oneness that is knowledge of itself. There is thus the separation of the knower and the known, of the esoteric and the exoteric. However, this known selfhood is still one and only one. That is, the universe exists within it as an undifferentiated potential. Ghalib expresses this as the oneness of Ahadiyat and Ahmadiyat. Those who are companions to oneness say the waves of Ahadiyat and Ahmadiyat are one. I'm trying to move my screen at the same time. This is the initial oneness of Hüsn and Aşk, particularly stressed in the passages in which Aşk is described with divine qualities, such as when his lovers are described as saying, Erini, show me to him, as Moses said to God in the Quran. The Beni Muhammad corresponds to the ontological level of Vahidiyat, in which God's names and attributes have manifested themselves within God's knowledge. Nusretgâh-ı Mana, the place described with qualities of paradise in the text, corresponds to the pre-eternal pact, where the souls of all created beings attest to the oneness of God. His initially unreciprocated love for Aşk, which Aşk later tells us was nothing but keeping his suffering secret, posits love as the reason for the creation of the universe, in line with the path of Ahmed al-Ghazali, in regards to which Ghalib mentions the hadith of, if it weren't for you, I would not have created the heavens, as we will see below. Hüsn expresses this with phrases such as, if his wish is to see the full moon, let me be the night. If he likes to watch the skies, let me be a star. Aşk's separation from Hüsn corresponds to the creation of the world of the seen, the universe as we know it. This is the Kawsal Nuzul, the arc of descent, of presences all the way to the perfect man, the physical being of the Prophet, in whom the arc of ascent, Al-Kawsal Uruj, is complete. This arc is none other than the Prophet's ascension. Considering that the Prophet's ascension is the archetype of the wayfarer's spiritual path, we can say that the two above-mentioned levels of allegory are deeply intertwined. As Holbrook also underlined, the priority of levels of manifestation is not a temporal priority, but an ontological one. The ontology of the downward arc is paralleled by the epistemology of the upward arc, that is, the Prophet's and the perfect man's knowledge of God and the universe. While Holbrook saw Ghalib's calls to the Saki, cupbearer, for inspiration, as well as his ruminations on language and poetry as digressions, in my reading of the work, they appear to conform to the same allegorical structure as the above-mentioned allegorical levels. One reason for Holbrook's perspective was her translation of Suhana's poetry, thus putting a linguistic barrier between the word of the poet and the word of God, the unity of which is manifested in the way the different allegorical levels mirror one another. Aşk himself, in his supplication to God to save him from the castle in which he's trapped, says, "O Lord, do not punish me for using..." Same thing. Can't seem to move. I'm just going to. It's okay. Do not punish me for using metaphor, because my use of metaphor and simile is only to be able to say these words. Similarly, within the tale, members of the tribe tell Aşk not to show effort and desire for poetry because it makes you think the imaginary is real. In my reading of the work, Ghalib's maturation as a poet and its composition of Hüsn Aşk form another allegorical level, in which Ghalib identifies himself with Aşk, and God is referred to as the cupbearer and asks for inspiration in several passages that interrupt the tale. In his first call to the cupbearer, Gâlib asks the cupbearer to offer the wine of inspiration, which is nothing but gum, suffering. O cupbearer, help me. I'm helpless and poor. I'm an aspirant to suffering in the market of calamity. I need a lot of cash of words to become a buyer of various kinds of suffering. Words, but those that come from intoxication, from fallenness and brokenness. Give me wine. The word has come to an end. The capital of suffering has run out. With this joy, the cupbearer of the wine of the gathering of meaning began to bestow soul. Whose longing increased. The moon, like the moon, she shrunk with pain day by day. We see something interesting happening here. It is only after Gâlib asks God for inspiration and is offered it in the form of suffering that the story is able to continue. A fact made more apparent by the addition of a subject title right before the couplet, in which we're told that the poet's supplication has been answered. This is why, in contrast with Holberg's reading, I'm not inclined to identify the author of the so-called digressions with Holberg's term of order, which she tries not to identify with Gâlib himself. In my opinion, these passages are as autobiographical as the below-mentioned passages on Rashid Effendi and Rumi. They offer us a glimpse of the poet in the act of creation. Let me go back just for a moment to my first slide. According to this lever of the allegory, the Molla-i Cünun is Gâlib's own father, Rashid Effendi, to whom he refers as his first master. Rashid Effendi is the person who advised Gâlib to add the section on the Prophet's ascension and who guided him towards Rumi's poetry when he was younger. Unfortunately, I have a 14-month-old and known Hany on Eid, so I haven't been able to finish translating and all of my poetry. But I think maybe this is a good thing because now you will be hearing some Turkish, and I will just try giving you a translation on the spot. Na güfte kalıp mata el miraç, kalmıştı bu hüsnü aşk bir taş. Söyle deyip etkin utka ikdam, feyzi nefesiyle oldu itmam. Bu gümrehin oldu destgiri, öğretti sühanda tarzı piri. Ne gibi beni o zatı vala, feyzi nefesiyle kıldı güya. So it is as I said before, it is his father who has advised him to add the section on the ascension, and from his childhood onwards, he's the one who taught him the tarz of pir. And Sühan, on the other hand, represents none other than Rumi, whose Mesnevi served as the ultimate guide for Gâlib, both in his spiritual quest as well as his self-education and achievement as a poet. We will see soon that these two are inseparable. As mentioned earlier, Gâlib calls Rumi the Anatolian prophet and refers to the Mesnevi as the essence of the Quran. Oldu ulemayı dine faik, peygamberi Rum denilse layık, manayı kelamı ruh bahşa, which, if you remember, was ruh bahşa was the exact same phrase we saw earlier in the supplication to the Saki. Mehdi gibi şer'i eyler ihya. İsm olmadı bir kitaba el-an, seyret şerefin ki mağzı Kur'an. He likens Gâlib likens Rumi to Jesus and the Mehdi. In a similar fashion, Sühan is referred to in his first description as Nebi-i Mürsel, God-sent prophet. Sühan has the capacity to take different shapes, give life, and make opposites causes of one another. Gâlib devotes a long passage at the end of his work to the influence of Rumi. Esrarını Mesnevi'den aldım, çaldım veli miri malı çaldım. So this was he stole from common property. Envar-ı fiyuz-ı mürşid-i Rum, afake firum etti malum. Kıldı beni tıflı mısra asa, doğdum doğalı Sühan'la berpa. So even as a child, thanks to Rumi, he was able to speak poetry. Bir minnet-ü üstad-ı talim, sername-i tablum etti tanzim. Feyz erdi Cenab-ı Mevlevi'den, aldım niçe ders Mesnevi'den. So, in this level of the allegory, Hüşrüba corresponds to the alim-ül misal, the imaginal world, one of the presences in Ibn Arabi's cosmogony. Via his imaginative faculty, the poet and the wali, the two are inseparable in this case, is able to summon existence in the imaginal world to the world of the seen. As Holbrook also underlines, this theoretical perspective is the framework for Gâlib's discourse on originality, wherein the possibility for original art can never be exhausted. As an act of bringing unseen images and words to the world of the seen, poetry is an act of creation, one that mirrors the creation of the universe. As Aşk's savior in his adventures, Sühan suddenly appears on scene to save Aşk, an act that is said to resemble God's command be that created the universe. The correlation between different levels of the allegory are thus made bare. The Sufi master's instruction of the disciple and the master poet's inspiration of the poet to be are posited as creative acts that resemble the creative act of God. Gâlib stresses that his creative power is aided by the feyz-i himmet, the blessing of spiritual power, and the feyz-i nefes, blessing of the breath, of his father Reşid Efendi, which we just saw, Rumi, and Shams. He refers to all three of them. The word nefes is particularly relevant in this context and allows us to understand why Aşk is repeatedly likened to Jesus in his descriptions. Like Jesus, the character Aşk, that is the perfect man and poet, breathes life into the world with his words. In this regard, the words of the saint are like the Quran, which is the carrier of the names and attributes of God via which the universe becomes manifest. In one couplet under the section named On the Nature of Poetryhood, Gâlib calls poetic inspiration Vahidi, the revelation to the heart. This is quite famous. Similarly, Sühan is referred to in the text as the sharer of Gabriel's secret, the guard of the treasure of revelation. He is the holder of the treasure of God's names. His arrival to take Aşk to the castle of the heart is described as a descent, like the descent of the light of the Quran. As one of the personifications of Sühan, Gâlib draws parallels between Rumi's relationship to the Mesnevi and the prophet's relationship to the Quran as the duality of meaning and form. According to Gâlib, the Quran carries the attributes of the prophet. Yes. His pure essence is described with, if it weren't for you. His attributes are to the Quran like the contained and the container. The Prophet's ascension is nothing but the return of the Quran to the skies, the way everything returns to its source. Just as Sühan is unable to accompany Aşk in the final moments of his journey as he unites with God, so is Gabriel unable to continue with Muhammad beyond the Sidra tree. For Gâlib, this is a moment meaning, mana, leaves behind the form of the word etfaz. Insofar as the various allegories within the text mirror one another, allegory number 2, the creation of Hüsn Aşk, also partakes in a theory of depth of the cycle. The downward arc culminates with the beginning of Hüsn Aşk, while the upward arc corresponds to its end, culminating in silence. The ending of the text, a mirror image of the return of the Quran to the skies. This also allows us to open a new avenue for interpreting Gâlib's frequent references to the impossibility of expressing God's majesty and oneness, a common Sufi trope. Indeed, Gâlib ends his work with words expressing his failure at his task. Again, quite often we see the similar trope and something similar in Attar as well. I remained, and those words stayed on my lips. The boat of my desire has pulled up its anchor. To conclude, Gâlib's multilingual mystical universe is one where each great piece of literary creation has to define its own theoretical outlook on language and literature. This outlook, which is the key to unlocking the various allegorical layers in the text, demands a dynamic and personal engagement with previous conceptualizations within the multicultural Islamic universe. In this regard, Gâlib's masterpiece is a unique adaptation of the doctrine of the oneness of being to the concept of language and literary creation. In this creative act, where the mystical and poetic are inseparable, his greatest muse and teacher is none other than Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi. Thank you.